Hello, welcome to this video about scatterplots. We'll be developing a scatterplot widget, as you can see here. You can also say it's a scatterplot node. If I execute, you can see that it has animations, it has a shape. It's focusing on these data I have over here, which are dynamic. I can change it and it will be updated. Through animations, I can also set a shape among rect and circle. I can also change the size, which becomes an animation as well. And finally, change the color. As you can see here. First things first, let's set up the UI. We'll be using the 2D section of Godot. We'll also be using a control node or user interface node. We could also use a 2D scene, but not in our case right now because a scatterplot usually is a UI element for the game or web app that it's using. So it's usually contained in a kind of menu or statistic menu or something like that. So as you can see here, I set up my GD script with a scatterplot node in a scatterplot scene. I saved it here and I'm ready to edit it. Now, the first thing to notice about editing it is that a control node is a canvas item, so inherits from a canvas item. And a canvas item is very important for us right now because it has a lot of methods of drawing, and we'll be using the draw circle and draw rect, which is somewhere around here, draw rect. We could also use different things, draw a polygon or a mesh or anything like that in the future, but for now we'll focus on circles and rectangles. So I've set up my export variables. I'll have the values to be set up in my scatterplot. I'll have a color, I'll have size, and also the shape, in which by default I'll just set up as a circle. Notice that if you want to have a drop-down box for the user to select something in the inspector window to the right, you can also include it like this so that you can show these specific options for the user. And I'll also have an animate option to allow the user or other developer to choose whether the scatterplot should be animated or not. Maybe the other developer can animate it by themselves or not. So I'll leave it as an optional feature. First, let's investigate what a draw is. Every canvas item has this function, which if you check the documentation, it's a virtual function you can override. And as you can see here, it basically allows you to define exactly how the canvas item is drawn by the engine. So we'll override it saying that I want to draw this canvas item like this. Now I can set up the circle to be drawn in this position, this size, and this color, depending on my input variables. This position is just for placeholder. If I execute my scene, I'll see a circle drawn in this position. Notice that I can't actually change anything on runtime. So if I come over here and change the size to something else, nothing will actually change here. If I exit, this size is actually the old one, so I'll need to change it here before, and then, and then execute it again to be able to see the change. So what I'll do for now is transform this script into a tool so that I can just see it here. What I usually do, personally speaking, I include a debug value just so that I can click and rerun things. So as you can see here, I just set up an export bool variable called debug, and in its setter, I just call update, which forces the canvas item to be updated, and this function is called again to be able to draw the circle once again. So if I go back here, my circle is drawn in my editor. If I change my color, and click debug, this will be updated. So this is just for debugging purposes. It helps me develop faster. So first things first, how do I actually draw things on screen depending on my input variables? So what I've did here, I updated my draw function to get the scale of my canvas item size. So this is also important. This is why I'm using the green little bit, the control, because the control has a size. By using this size, I can get the maximum and minimum value of my input values, which right now I've set it up like this. My maximum X would be 2, my maximum Y would be 3, my minimum X and Y would be 0, as you can see here to the right. So I just do this little for loop to make sure I get the maximum and minimum variables from within this array. And then I use this very nifty, cool function called lerp. The range lerp accepts a value and it changes this value from a domain range to an output range. This basically means if the input is 0, for example, in a domain from 0 to 1, and I want to change it to the range of 0 to 10, a 0 will be still 0, but a half, 0.5, would be 5. So for example, I'll just copy here. If this was 0, from 0 to 1, when I change it to 0 to 10, this will be still 0 because it's the same as this first value. If this was 0.5, I'll actually get the in between here because 0.5 is the middle point between these two. So I'll use this to change from my domain, which is from this minimum and maximum X and minimum and maximum Y, to the scale that I got here in my canvas item. I do also some little fixy things here, making sure that my Y is going, instead of coming from this position down, I make it start from this position and go up. I could do this in different ways, but I just chose to do the math in my case. And finally, I draw the circle with these two positions, the size that I've set up and the color that I've set up. As you can see here, it's already running. I can update anything here and it will change my editor. So the next step is to animate when I change something. In my case here, I'm starting out with the color. I added a setter here called set color, and I also added a tween in my control node, which will handle the animation. We will be using tween's interpolate property to change the color. This interpolate property requires an object, which in my case will be just this class itself, the property itself to be animated, the initial final variable value, and the duration. There are some other optional parameters as well. If you want to take a look, just check the documentation. And as you can see here, I updated my set color to use my tween value. If the tween is active, which means I'm doing an animation, I want to update the color and also call the update function so that I draw again my scatter plot. Otherwise, if this is the first time that I actually am calling the set color, I want to start the interpolate from whatever color I'm on right now to the value that I just received. This 2 here is the animation size. I'm taking 2 seconds, which I believe it's the time length set up here, and then I start my tween. If you see here, I can now change my color, and it takes a little while to go to the new color. Of course, if I just keep doing this, some bugs will happen because I'm changing it too fast. And now I've also added the same functionality to my size. I added the setGet here, my setter for the size. I also verified if the tween exists, just to make sure everything is all right. And now, as you can see here, I can change my values by typing here. Of course, the values over here that appear in the inspector now are kind of bugged out because they don't properly change when they are updating, but that's fine. This is just a UI glitch. For my shape, I won't be doing animation because for now we are just using these root or very crude way of creating and generating circles and rectangles. I set up my setter once again just to make sure I'm calling update if I change it. And I did some changes here in the draw to make sure that if the shape is a circle, I'll draw a circle, and if my shape is a rectangle, I'll actually draw a rectangle. And the rectangle actually requires a rect as a first value, which has the left top point of the rectangle and also the size. So the size over here, I multiplied the size value by 2 as a vector 2 because I have an x and a y size. And for the starting point, I set up the middle point and I subtracted 1 times of this value. So this is basically half of the width and half of the height. So with this, now we have the capability of changing from circle to rectangles. Notice that we can also include here other draw directives, even mesh directives or texture directives. Probably will do this in the future, but for now this is okay. Now for the values. So the values are much more complicated because they are actually a vector or a pool vector 2 array to be more specific. And because of that, we can't actually use this interpolate property properly. So instead of doing like this, we'll be using an interpolate method. So in the same similar fashion that we did for color and for size, in the values we'll have the main value be changed and we'll have an auxiliary value for the values through this drawn values. So this drawn values will be the values that are drawn currently in the scatter plot. And this is the one that we'll be using over here. So we'll replace all the values with what's in this draw values. And by using the interpolate method in the tween, we will interpolate between 0 and 1, and also using 2 seconds as my animation step, calling this method. So interpolate method, differently from interpolate property, will call a method in every step of the animation. So I set up this little function here, which receives this range ID, which will go from 0 to 1 according to this method. And what I'll do is to lerp. This function is very good also. If we go to the documentation, it has 3 inputs, 3 arguments. From to, which is the range that I want to go from and to, and the weight, which is where inside this range I want to my value, the output value, to be. So for example, I can lerp from 0 to 4. This is 3/4, right? So 3/4 of this range would be 3. Or even lerp a vector 2 like this. In our case, we will be lerping the vector 2 values that are inside the pool vector 2 array by using this weight as the range ID. Remember, range ID, or the weight that goes in the third argument, needs to be between 0 and 1. So this is why we're setting up our animation to interpolate between 0 and 1. So given that, we go through all the values and we interpolate between the previous values that we had. So these two are my temporary arrays. This one has the previous values, this one has the new values, and this one will have the current value that I'm actually drawing. Once my range ID gets to 1, it's when I finish my animation. So I'll just update my temp value as my drawn value. This would be the same as doing this, equivalent. And I also call my update every time that I animate using this. So if I have set up everything right, here are my squares. If I change one of the values, it should move. So let me use this 0, 0, which is this rectangle over here. I will make it go to this place. You'll notice that other things will change depending on what I do. But let's see, this is 3. So if x is 3, we'll go this way. Well, actually, this was 2. So notice that I actually passed the x value of these two. So because of this, our min and max values that are calculated using the size updated the scaling proportion of our scatter plot. So this is what we want to do to guarantee that every time we draw our scatter plot, it never goes beyond the bounding box that it has. So now we can just play around and do whatever. But also notice that if I increase the number here, we'll have a bunch of errors because now my previous arrays, drawn values and temp drawn values don't actually have the same number of values. So now there are 5 values here in this array. These two arrays only have 4 and now they are out of sync. So for now, I won't animate this in specific. And this is how it becomes. So I just check if my drawn values or temp drawn values, you can use either array, is the same size as my original array. If it isn't, it means that there is either a new value in the array or one of the values was deleted. I won't animate this for now. So I just associate everything and make sure that my draw value, my draw method over here is called. So with this, I can actually add a bunch and change the values or delete them, and everything will be fine. One other thing that I forgot to mention is I also added this animate over here to make sure that if I have animate selected, I do the animation, but otherwise I don't. So first, in the set values, I guarantee that if I only do this when I animate, so I just use these values here if I'm actually animating, and also here to make sure I don't actually interpolate anything if I'm not animating. On the set color, I don't actually call this if animate is false. I call this only, and same thing for size. With this, if animate is false, it's unselected, I can change everything with no animation, and if I select it, the animation is back. So with this, let's create some sort of UI that uses this scatter plot somehow. So here I have my main menu control node. I will make it color rect. I'll also make sure I'm not using the entire screen just because I want so. My color rect is white. I'll just make it a little bit grayish to be more beautiful. I can also add a VBox container to contain everything that I have within. I can also make a label just so that it has my main menu value over here. I can align it properly and give it a little bit of size in the Y direction. I could also change the the colors around, but for now I'll just leave it like this, or even change the font or everything. I can also add some buttons as I had in my original example in the beginning of the video. I can also add a margin container to make sure everything has a proper margin within my main menu. I'll make sure this is a full rect and that it has some kind of margin. Sure. And finally, I can add my scatterplot, which should be from here, my scatterplot 2. So as you can see here, it's not properly using my size, so I'll just expand it vertically. It's also overlapping around the bounding box, which is kind of expected. As we saw here, is like the shape of my squares or circles go outside. So to fix this, we can also use a margin container. So by using a margin container, expanding the vertical sense and adding some margin. This margin specific I can't change because it's being controlled by the VBox. But I can add some custom constraints like this. And now my scatterplot is properly set up. I can change the color, it animates, I can change the size. And it was already like this, I believe, yeah. Or make it smaller. And I can also change the shape. Now we have a scatterplot that you can use in your application, in your game. Of course, there's no indication of what are the values of each of the points, each of the circles or rectangles, or what they mean. But we'll tackle this in the next video. See you then.